Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another classic 90s Goosebumps television show episode review for you all. This episode comes from Season 3. It was written by Andrea Raffagello and directed by Stefan Sciani. And the episode in question is Teacher's Pet. Now I laugh because a lot of people know about this episode these days. This has become one of the most hated Goosebumps episodes in recent years, as more and more people get to actually watching the entire show, or maybe reconnect to the show from their childhood, or maybe for the first time. This is one that I see a lot of people dunking on in the community. And after watching this for, I think now the 4th or 5th time in my lifetime, I have to say I understand completely where people are coming from with this episode. Because if I'm being honest, this has to be one of the most forgettable pieces of crap ever made in Goosebumps. It's down there with some of the worst short stories, some of the worst books. Definitely one of the worst episodes from this show. Arguably top 5 contender. And a strong one at that. So take that for what you will. But this episode also weirdly kind of falls into that trapping that some other episodes kind of fall down with the so bad it's good quality or label put on it. So if you're one of those people that actively look for bad media, this might be up your alley. And this is one of those episodes. I think this and Strained Peas give the Tales to Give You Goosebumps adaptations a bad name. And that's putting aside the controversy that is an Old Stories episode in of itself. But Teacher's Pet, y'all, I'm not a fan wholesale. So you need to know that going in before we go any further in this review. If you're expecting a glowing review from me, it's not happening. And I saved this one for last for the Tales to Give You Goosebumps episode adaptations because I really had no interest in getting to this anytime soon. And I'm kind of at the point where I'm trying to tie up some loose ends and finish up some series when I can. And this was one thing I wanted to knock out so I can finally do my ranking of these episodes. So there's that. So with that out the way, let's get into the episode adaptation here without giving too much away for Teacher's Pet here. So the story starts off with two friends, Becca and Benji, and they seem to be a little bit older than your average Goosebumps protagonist. They seem to maybe be like 13 or 14 years old, and they're packed up and they arrive at this location out in the middle of the woods. It's in an undisclosed location, but their entire class and their teacher is there, so it seems like they're going on this overnight field trip adventure, so to speak, out there to observe Mother Nature and the food chain, as we'll get to know in the rest of the story. But Beck and Benji, when they arrive, they want to do some exploring and walk around to see what's around in the woods, to get away from all their classmates who are pretty much just mean to them. And while in the woods, they hear some strange noises, and Becca notices that she lost her good luck locket, which matters in the story, I guess, early on. We have no backstory or build up to that, but it's just a thing. And when Becca goes to look for it and finds it, she sees this bunny rabbit, and when she picks up the bunny because she thinks it's cute, it may or may not have a reptile's face in a really bad CGI kind of way. And this, of course, freaks Becca out and catches the attention of Benji as well. And Becca doesn't know what to think of it, but Benji's like, all right, we got to meet up with the rest of the class. Let's get out of here. Things are too weird. Well, when they meet up with their classmates, they find their teacher in this open area. And they sit down with their fellow classmates to hear what this, I guess, nature guide named Mr. Blankenship is going to present them. And Mr. Blankenship kind of goes on this spiel of sorts about Mother Nature and the food chain and his admiration for a specific species of animal known as snakes. And he pulls out this giant, like, boa constrictor, I think. Correct me if I'm getting the snake species wrong. That's what it looks like in the episode. Well, he pulls it out, and then he says that snakes have been around for millions of years, and they survived mass extinctions. They are apex predators, and they're some of the the most equipped animals in the entire ecosystem that will outlast most others because of their adaptability and stuff like that. So he pulls out a mouse to kind of show the students what it's like to witness a feeding of a snake, essentially, and Mother Nature at its work, whatever, and how this phenomenon happens every second of every minute of every day that humans just don't see because they live in society, right? So once the kids witness that, of course, they're all kind of grossed out by it, but the teacher decides to build on that lesson Mr. Blankenship shared with the kids and told them to go out and explore the woods nearby for about an hour so they can observe the food chain at play, and they needed to partner up. So Becca and Benji partner up again, and they go out into the woods and they find some, animal grub on some logs, and they're looking at that. And then they notice a lodge nearby, and Becca gets this bright idea to break and enter, even though there's no trespassing signs posted all over the place. And Benji thinks it's a bad idea, but once Becca breaks into the door, a bunch of bats fly out of it in that crappy CGI kind of way. And if you're familiar with the Season 3 and Season 4 intro of Ultimate Goosebumps, and you hear the bat sound effect, that comes from this episode. So they take that for what you will. It's pretty cringe. But once the two enter the lodge, they observe around and they notice something's off inside of this place. There's like, weird creatures, roam, in jars and stuff. And they open up some cabinets and stuff and see some, what looks like to be experiments and what have you. And the kids realize that the place is pretty much vacated and somebody's using it for something. They just don't know what it is yet. And they encounter a giant snake kind of looking at them and trying to intimidate them. And of course, the two try to, make sense of what's going on. And for about a few minutes, they're just staring at the snake, and the snake's slowly slithering towards them. And they're not moving. They're just too traumatized, I guess, because they're afraid of snakes or whatever. And then they come up with a distraction enough to get out of the cabin and start running in the woods. And we get this shot where it's implied that the snake is like pretty much speed slithering to follow them, to get to them. But luckily for Benji and Becca, they end back up with their fellow classmates and their teacher, and they want to hang out there for the rest of the day because it's safety in numbers, essentially. Well, after that point, it's getting late, and there's a campfire, and Becca nods off to sleep and has this fake-out dream sequence of a snake crawling on her, and then her teacher, for some reason, having the rabbit from earlier with the reptile face to shove in her face. And once she wakes up from her nightmare, she notices that everybody's asleep. And she goes over to her friend Benji and says, hey, look, something's going on with this cabin. Something feels off. Let's go investigate it. And they go back to the cabin one last time at nighttime. And they venture in and they find even more hidden secrets inside of these cupboards. And they see these things called amino acids. And they look like, the experiments aren't just putting animals into jars. It looks like they're trying to mutate animal DNA and whatnot. And sure enough, there's a plot twist involving the person from earlier, Mr. Blankenship, that comes into the forefront. And he pretty much drops a bombshell on the kids that he has been doing experiments on animal DNA and stuff, trying to, experiment around and give animal species the kick from other species that are more equipped to adapt and survive longer, especially when you're looking at the timeline of life itself. He's kind of doing this for altruistic motives, so to speak. But there's another twist on top of that with Mr. Blankenship, and this recontextualizes an event that happened earlier in the episode. And Becca and Benji may or may not be in harm's way, and they have to figure out something to get them out of this situation they're in. And it may or may not involve the experiment ingredients and stuff lying around the lodge. And it seems like they might be out of the situation. But by the end of the episode, there's a recontextualization about kind of what happened in the climax with a certain character. And there might be a phenomenon that the the two kids, Becca and Benji, started, that might be implying that kids might be starting to mutate because of what they did. I'll just leave it there. But that, in a nutshell, is what you're going to expect out of the Teacher's Pet episode, without giving too much away, of course. So, off the bat, if you're not familiar with Teacher's Pet or, its origins, Teacher's Pet was a short story in Tales to Give You Goosebumps, book number 1. And that short story is far different than this episode. This may as well be an in-name only episode. And I don't know if Andrea Raffagello looked at the concept and said, hey, I just want to make my own thing here. But off the bat, in terms of positives, I think this setup, or idea, I should say, for the story is way better than the short story's counterpart. Now, when we get down to execution, entertainment, and where the story kind of goes with the idea, it's not all there compared to the short story, in my opinion. But this one is still serviceable as a concept, and I kind of wish it was done better, but that's one thing I can really appreciate about this, is the concept itself. The second thing I think I really enjoy about this episode is the acting from Becca's character. Now, if you don't know the tragedy associated with Teacher's Pet episode, it's linked to a quite now famous urban legend that's been debunked for many years. And that is Michelle Reese, the actress who plays Becca in this episode, died shortly after this episode wrapped up filming, I think in 1996 or 7, due to a case of meningitis. And she lost her life at a young age. I think she was maybe 15 or 16. And the episode commemorates her memory at the end, once the twist ending, cuts out. And knowing that about this, and knowing that this was Michelle Reese's, final thing she ever made, or one of the few things she ever starred in because she was so young, I have to look back on this and say she had a lot of potential to go far in her career. And it's a tragedy what happened to her. It really is. And if her family out there is watching this, or anybody that might have known Michelle, and you happen to stumble across this review, I'm assuming she was a nice person. And I want to say that her acting was really good. Benji, however, he may as well not have been in the episode or had like any speaking parts, because Michelle pretty much monopolized most of the dialogue in the story. Right? So, take that for what you will if you're looking for acting performances. Now, the show stealer arguably is Mr. Blankenship, which I think is my final compliment to it, other than one technical thing that I think they do kind of cool here. Mr. Blankenship is played by the same actor who played Spidey in Say Cheese and Die's original episode with Ryan Gosling. And he is fantastic. As always, he never gives a bad performance, and he's kind of creepy in this episode. And I think he's way creepier than the Mr. Blankenship counterpart we got in the short story, so that's kind of cool. And I like the angle they take with his character a little bit, where they try to make him like an experimenter on animals and trying to, make the perfect specimen for the food chain. That's kind of a cool angle to go, I would say. And on the technical aspects, there are some pretty neat things that Stefan Scanny was able to do here, surprisingly. And we haven't gotten to the atrocities that this episode brings to the table. But nonetheless, there is some really cool shots near the back half of the episode involving lighting. Whenever Mr. Blankenship is dropping some information, there's just something about the editing of how this light twitches in there that's kind of creepy and well done. And I think that's a really cool artistic way to kind of build tension in the scene. And I can definitely see that Stefan Scanny at least had some idea for some creepy shots. Now, the budget was not there for his ideas, I'm assuming. And this has to be one of the weakest budgeted episodes I've seen in Goosebumps across the history of anything ever associated with it. And that's saying a lot for a low-budget show from the 90s, specifically. But I can tell that he was trying here, and that's all you can really ask for at the end of the day. Now, when it comes to negatives, there's a lot to unpack with this, and those sound positives do get weighed down because of these negatives here. I'm going to start off with the plot. The plot is so non-engaging. This has to be one of the most meh executions of a concept I have ever seen in kids horror. Not only does the story kind of register flatly because it's so generic in the beginning, where these kids, they just are out in the woods with their classmates on a field trip. There's a sleepaway event, but there's no exposition with these characters. They just kind of stumble into this, right? So the episode kind of relies on what a few episodes from later seasons of Goosebumps had to do, which was, you know, just throw these characters out there and then just give them character and personality as the episode goes along. And the sucky thing is that the story heavily implies on this mystery of this cabin and what's going on in these woods. And very, very early on, when you see that rabbit with the reptile face, you already know the angle they're going. They're going some sci-fi creature feature type idea with this. And the imagination can only take you so many places before you already know the direction they're going. It makes it predictable, so you're kind of waiting around for, all right, when are they going to stumble across this animal experimentation mutation thing, or if the land is somehow, you know, radioactive or something. Yeah, it's just non-engaging. The acting outside of the main two characters, the other characters in this episode may as well just be, you know, imprints on wallpaper because they do nothing to serve the story. Minus early on when these two mean girls are kind of making some scoffs at Becca, but even then, that's not enough to salvage with those characters. It's just, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like I'm rambling on, but there's really nothing interesting about this episode whatsoever. And the interesting things sadly make it predictable, like I said, and it just goes nowhere interesting with it and does nothing inventive with it. The second big negative about this episode is the freaking effects. The effects. Oh my lord. You know, season 3 of Goosebumps and season 4 get a bad rap for bad CGI. And this is one that I could totally see why people have that. The bat CGI is terrible. Whether we're talking about the stuff in the later half with transformation scenes. Now, I will give some credit here. This is one of the episodes in the Goosebumps show from the 90s that tries to do transformation scenes, but if you're not familiar with how syndicated television allowed transformation scenes to be back in these 90s shows, specifically on places like Fox Kids, the transformations are essentially, you have a character and their face is being contorted by some silly and goofy looking effect to become whatever it's trying to be. And in this case, it's a snake. It's very lame. And oh my lord, the thing that you see at the very end of the episode has to be one of the worst things I have ever seen CGI create. And I've seen a lot of low-budget movies with just terrible dog crap CGI. And that's saying something. I mean, the CGI and the twist of this episode is absolutely dog crap. I'm sorry. Now, the line delivery is kind of cringe in that funny way, but come on, y'all. You can't tell me that the CGI and the effects in this episode isn't god-awful. Even the rabbit with the reptile face looks crappy. I mean, it's just really bad. And when we're getting down to the nitty-gritty here, getting into some more negatives, I guess these are more nitpicks than outright negatives compared to the other things I've talked about. But the fake-out dream sequences, why is that even in the story? Like, why does that have to be a thing? You know, it's kind of shoehorned in there to make Becca want to go back to the cabin and investigate, which is already a really dumb decision because she went there earlier, she got chased out by a snake, and the snake is really fast and has like supersonic slither speed. So why would you want to go back there to solve the mystery of this? Like I said, and this ties back to how the plot executes and unfolds. You don't feel much weight to these decisions with these characters, and you don't really feel much intrigue or care that they go back to the cabin. You know what I mean? Like, there's not enough in it for the audience to be invested from the get-go. So all these plot points, they just feel like, all right, when is this thing gonna... You feel like you get to the point where you're thinking to yourself, all right, when is this thing gonna end? And I find myself thinking that every time I have seen this episode. It's pitiful. It's pitiful. And the climax is barely a climax. They go back into the cabin. They talk with Mr. Blankenship. You get that, you know, twist on top of a twist, and how it resolves is rather quick and very loose. I know this is supposed to be like a sci-fi creature feature thing, but what? Like, how did this actually happen? And the way it's shown on screen, you see some shed snake skin. I'll just leave it at that. How does that happen? Who knows? I guess they did that to kind of show that something was there, at least. I don't know. That's as far as I'm going to go with it. But yeah, it's just really bland and very mediocre all the way around. So my actual thoughts with this, right? I think at the best this episode can be is just straight up mediocre. I mean, this is down there with some of the weaker Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes that go in one ear and out the other. This is down there with some of the weaker Haunting Hour episodes that are just forgettable. There's not a lot of them, but they still have a similar feeling to this. Now, Teacher's Pet, is it as bad? Is it the absolute worst Goosebumps episode ever made? I actually don't think so. I actually don't. I think there's a little more care into this, and whether we're talking about this versus the short story counterpart, this is an obvious improvement on that idea, in my opinion. Like I said, the execution is just where it fails completely. It falls apart right from the get-go. So, because it's just mediocre at best, and you have all these problems, even though there's some sound positives, those problems just take away all the enjoyment. It sucks the life force out of me to watch this episode each and every time because of just how flat this episode registers. And no offense to Stefan Skaney, Andrea Raffagello, or the acting team involved with this episode. They all seem to care and wanted to do the product justice, but at the end of the day, this episode suffered because of budget and probably because the network can only do so much with the concept and they only have a certain amount to run with. And because of that, it doesn't fare well with some ideas. And this is one where I can appreciate the ambition, but perhaps maybe they bit off more they can chew with the runtime here. So yeah, take that for what you will. But from a 0 to 5 star basis, even if the negatives I had weren't that pronounced, this max would probably hit a 3.2. With that being said, I knew it was getting at the highest, maybe like a mid, between a 3 to a 3.4, right? But those problems just sunk it further and further and further down for me. And honestly, I think this is a pretty terrible episode. Not, like I said, it's not the worst episode from Goosebumps or in Kids Horror for that matter, in my opinion. But it's in the contention. I used to full on hate this episode at one point. I used to think this was like just the worst thing in Goosebumps ever made. But I don't really think that anymore. I think there is some more commendable things than other terrible things out there. So I'm willing to give this thing a higher end of my F tier, which, if you don't know, it goes from a 1 to a 1.5 to a 2. And 2 is the absolute ceiling. This gets an F+, I guess. And like I said, I'm willing to get, like, the 2 out of 5 stars comes from those positives. And because I at least have a little more fun with this and some other things that I have given lower scores, I'm perfectly comfortable giving it this score. And I think I'm being more than fair on this episode. Trust me, y'all. If you think this episode's more fine or whatever, I totally get it. If you think this episode is the worst thing ever that you've seen, I kind of get it. It's nothing good by any means. But that's just where I'm at with it. If you've never seen this episode before in the Goosebumps show, you really do not need to watch this. And you should only watch it if you want to experience everything that Goosebumps has ever put out. If you're not in that crowd, just don't waste your time. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Teacher's Pet episode. Let me know down in the comment section. If you've seen this episode before, do you love it? Do you hate it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.